Welcome to Revenge Central. Today I will read 2 brand new revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing and let's get started with Story 1. My manager was stealing our tips for 2 years. We took it all back. Phase 0. Background and operational context. I spent 4 years in college grinding through an accounting degree while simultaneously working as a bartender. Not the college bar kind of bartender where you pour light beer into red plastic cups and call it a shift. I mean real bartending. Craft cocktails, 14-hour Saturday nights behind a mahogany bar top that cost more than my first car, with a wine list that ran 40 pages, and a regular clientele who thought nothing of dropping $400 on dinner for 2. The restaurant was called Ember and Oak. It sat on the corner of 5th and Monroe in downtown Portland, tucked into a renovated brick building that had originally been a textile warehouse in the 1920s. The owners had sunk $2.3 million into the renovation alone: exposed steel beams, reclaimed Oregon Douglas fir flooring, a custom-built open kitchen with a wood-fired grill that you could smell from the sidewalk on a cold night. Ember and Oak was the kind of place where the Oregonian food critic showed up unannounced twice a year, and where you might see the mayor eating a bone-in ribeye at the corner table on a Tuesday. The check averages ran between $90 and $140 per cover. We did between 300 and 400 covers on a busy Friday night. The bar alone, just the 12 seats at my station and the 6 at the lounge bar, could do $8,000 to $12,000 in revenue on a weekend night. I started there as a barback in my junior year of college. Moved up to bartender 6 months later. By the time I graduated and passed my CPA exam, I was one of 3 senior bartenders on a staff of 14 service employees. I was making decent money, good money, actually. Portland's minimum wage for tipped employees was reasonable, and with tips factored in, I was clearing $60,000 to $70,000 a year while working 4 to 5 shifts a week. But here is the thing about working in fine dining when you actually understand numbers. You start noticing things that other people don't. The general manager was a guy named Derek Holland, 44 years old, former Marine. He had the kind of jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been with Ember and Oak since before it opened. The owner, Richard Zhang, had brought him in during the construction phase to handle operations. Derek ran the floor like a military operation. He was precise, demanding. He did pre-shift meetings every day at 3:45 p.m. sharp, and God help you if you were 30 seconds late. He knew every regular by name, knew their wine preferences, remembered their anniversaries. From a guest's perspective, Derek Holland was the perfect general manager. From a staff perspective, he was something else entirely. The tip structure at Ember and Oak was supposed to be straightforward. We used a software system called TipSync Pro, a cloud-based tip management platform that integrated with our POS system, Aloha. At the end of each shift, every server and bartender entered their total tips into TipSync. The system then calculated tip-outs based on a fixed percentage structure. Bartenders received 15% of total bar sales in tip-out from servers, whose tables ordered drinks from the bar. Barbacks received 5% of total bar tips. Bussers received 3% of total dining room tips. The food runners, who we called expediters because Ember and Oak was fancy like that, received 4%. The remaining tips, after all tip-outs were calculated and distributed, were what each individual server or bartender kept. This is standard industry practice. This is what every server and bartender at Ember and Oak believed was happening. I believed it too, for a long time. The first whisper of doubt came about 18 months into my tenure. It was a slow Tuesday night in November. I had bar-backed for Marcus, one of the other senior bartenders, before picking up my own shift. Marcus had done maybe $2,000 in bar sales that night. At 15% tip-out from servers plus his own direct tips, he should have walked with somewhere around $280 to $320. Instead, he was staring at the TipSync summary on his phone with this expression like somebody had kicked him in the stomach. 211, he said. I leaned over the bar, looked at his screen. That can't be right. You had that big whiskey flight order from the bachelor party alone. That was $180 in sales. Tell me about it. I even checked the math on the server tip-outs. It's short, like noticeably short. I didn't think much of it at the time. Tuesday nights are weird. People tip inconsistently. Sometimes you get a table that runs up a $300 tab and leaves $40. It happens. Marcus was annoyed, but neither of us pursued it. The second whisper came 3 months later, in February. I was working a Saturday night double, the afternoon shift and then the evening shift. I tracked my sales carefully because I was trying to hit a specific savings goal for a down payment on a condo. I wrote down my running sales total on a bar napkin every hour, the old school way, and compared it to my Aloha printout at the end of the night. My total bar sales for the shift were $9,412. My direct tips, cash and card, were $1,708. The server tip out at 15% should have been $1,412. So my total should have been $3,120. TipSync showed my total take-home as $2,640. That was $480 short, nearly $500, in one night. Now, I am an accountant. I double-checked everything. I went through every single ticket on the Aloha system. I verified the percentages. I checked the tip-out calculation against the actual server sales that included bar orders. The math was unambiguous. I was short $476.31 to be exact. I didn't say a word. Not to Marcus, not to Jessica, the other senior bartender, not to any of the servers. I went home that night, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, and started a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet would eventually become the most important document of my professional life. Phase 1. Reconnaissance and initial data collection. Objective: establish baseline financial patterns and identify anomalies in tip distribution. My approach was methodical. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation. A software glitch, a miscalculation, some arcane feature of TipSync that I didn't understand. I wanted to be wrong. Being wrong meant I was just a bartender making good money. Being right meant something much worse. For the next 6 weeks, I tracked everything. Every shift, every sale, every tip out. I kept a small moleskin notebook in my apron pocket, the kind bartenders use to write drink orders, and I recorded my hourly sales, my cash tips, my card tips, and the final TipSync distribution number. I also started paying very close attention to Derek's behavior around the tip system. Here is what I observed during those 6 weeks. 1. Derek was the only person at Ember and Oak with administrative access to TipSync Pro, not Richard Zhang, the owner. Not the assistant manager, a woman named Sandra Chen. Derek and Derek alone could adjust tip distributions, modify percentage structures, and override individual tip entries. 2. Derek always stayed at least 45 minutes after close on Fridays and Saturdays, sometimes an hour. He told the staff it was because he was doing inventory and closing reports, but I noticed, because I was specifically looking, that he spent a significant portion of that time on the back office computer, the one in his office that had the TipSync dashboard open. 3. Derek processed the weekly tip payouts himself. At Ember and Oak, tips were distributed through a combination of nightly cash payouts and weekly direct deposits for card tips. Derek handled both. He would count out cash at the end of each night and hand it to us in envelopes. The direct deposits came through on Wednesdays. Derek was the one who approved the deposit amounts in TipSync before they were sent to payroll processing. 4. And this was the detail that made my stomach drop. I noticed that on several occasions, Derek would make adjustments in TipSync after the shift had ended. I know this because one night I was waiting for my ride in the back hallway, and his office door was slightly open. I saw him on the TipSync dashboard. He was in the post-shift adjustments module. He was typing. He clicked something. He closed the laptop. I didn't see the screen clearly enough to know what he changed, but I saw enough to know he was changing something. By the end of those 6 weeks, my moleskin notebook was full. I had detailed records for 23 shifts. And the pattern was unmistakable. I was being shorted an average of $212 per shift. Not every shift. Some shifts the numbers were close to correct, within $5 or $10, which I attributed to rounding and timing. But on busy nights, Fridays, Saturdays, holidays, event nights, The shortage was significant: $300, $400, sometimes $500. Over those 23 shifts, I calculated that I was short a total of $4,876. Extrapolated over a year, assuming roughly 240 working shifts, that was roughly $50,000. From me alone. I was one of 3 senior bartenders and 11 total tipped employees. The scope of the theft, if my calculations were correct, was staggering. But I needed more data. I needed to know if this was happening to everyone or just me. And I needed to understand exactly how Derek was doing it. The mechanics of the theft, the specific software manipulation. I needed to go deeper. Phase 2, Deep Intelligence Gathering. Objective: map the full extent of the financial manipulation and identify the specific mechanisms used to divert tip funds. I want to be clear about something. At this stage, I did not confront anyone. I did not discuss my findings with any coworker. This was critical. If Derek was doing what I suspected he was doing, he had been doing it for a long time, which meant he was careful, which meant he was good at it, which meant any hint that someone was onto him could trigger defensive action, deletion of records, destruction of evidence, or worse. I was dealing with a former Marine. I needed to assume he was capable of operational countermeasures. Instead of confronting, I gathered. I collected data the way a forensic accountant collects data, systematically, comprehensively, and with meticulous documentation. First, I needed access to TipSync's historical data. Derek controlled the admin account, but TipSync Pro had a feature that most users didn't know about. Every individual employee had access to their own complete tip history through their personal login. The personal dashboard showed every shift, every tip entry, every tip out received, and every adjustment made to their account. I logged into my personal TipSync account from my laptop at home and exported every single shift record going back to my first day at Ember & Oak. The export came as a CSV file, comma-separated values, the bread and butter of data analysis. I dumped it into Excel and started building pivot tables. The results confirmed my worst suspicions. Going back 3 years, the full extent of my employment, the pattern was consistent and growing worse over time. In my first year, the shortages were small, $20 to $40 per shift on average, easily attributable to rounding errors or minor software glitches, which is exactly what I would have assumed if I hadn't been tracking carefully. In my second year, the average shortage grew to about $150 per shift. By my third year, it was over $200. Derek was escalating. He was taking more as time went on, either because he was getting bolder or because the restaurant's revenue was growing and the larger tip pool provided more cover. Total estimated shortage over 3 years for me personally: $112,000 and change. That number made me physically ill. $112,000. That was a house down payment. That was 2 years of student loan payments. That was the kind of money that changes your life, and it had been stolen from me a few dollars at a time, hidden in the noise of nightly tip fluctuations. Now I needed to know if the same thing was happening to the rest of the staff. The challenge was that I couldn't access other employees' TipSync records without their login credentials. I couldn't just ask them for their records. That would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. So I found another way. I started having conversations. Casual ones, the kind that happen behind the bar, during slow periods or on smoke breaks. Hey Marcus, you ever feel like your tip numbers don't quite match what you expect? Marcus, who was polishing a cocktail shaker, didn't even look up. Every damn day, brother. I just figured it was the software. What do you mean? You know how it is. You think you made 300. TipSync says 250. You can't really prove it, because the server tip-outs are calculated automatically, and you don't know exactly which tables ordered bar drinks. It's this black box, man. You just trust it. That phrase, "you just trust it," became a refrain. I heard it from almost every tipped employee I spoke with. Brianna, a server who had been at Ember & Oak for 4 years. Devante, a bartender who had started 6 months before me. Amy, a part-time server who worked lunch shifts. Every single one of them had noticed discrepancies. Every single one of them had dismissed it as software quirks or their own bad math. Derek had created the perfect theft mechanism, The discrepancies were large enough to be significant, thousands of dollars per person per year, but small enough relative to total nightly earnings that no individual felt confident enough to challenge them. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a $5 shortage here, a $20 shortage there. On any given night, you could convince yourself you miscounted. I spoke with 11 of the 14 tipped employees over the course of 2 weeks. 10 of them confirmed that they had noticed persistent shortages in their tip distributions. The 11th, a relatively new server named Tyler, said he hadn't really paid attention. He had only been working at Ember and Oak for 3 months. I also made a point to reconnect with former employees. This was crucial. If Derek had been doing this since the restaurant opened, which was now 5 years, then former employees were also victims, and their testimony would be essential for building an airtight case. I found 5 former employees through social media and mutual connections. I met 2 of them for coffee. I had phone calls with the other 3. And every single one of them described the same pattern. I always felt like I was making less than I should have, said Priya, who had been a server at Ember and Oak for 2 years before leaving to go to nursing school. But it's fine dining, you know? The money is still good compared to other restaurants. I just figured the tip-outs were eating more than I realized. My roommate and I both worked there, said James, a former barback. We used to compare our numbers sometimes, and they never quite added up, but Derek was so intimidating that nobody wanted to question it. Intimidating. That word came up a lot too. The intelligence picture was becoming clear. Derek had been systematically skimming tips from the entire service staff for the entire 5-year history of the restaurant. The mechanism was administrative access to TipSync Pro combined with exclusive control over payout processing. The cover was the inherent complexity of tip distribution in a fine dining environment, combined with a workplace culture of deference to Derek's authority. Now I needed to understand the exact technical mechanism. How was he doing it? What buttons was he pressing in TipSync? Phase 3. Technical analysis of the theft mechanism. Objective: identify the specific software operations and procedural vulnerabilities exploited by the subject. I spent a Saturday afternoon watching every TipSync Pro tutorial video on the company's YouTube channel. I read the entire user manual, 214 pages of dense, boring software documentation. I called TipSync's customer support under the pretense of being a restaurant owner evaluating the software for a new venture, and I asked detailed questions about the admin functionality. What I learned was this. TipSync Pro had 3 levels of access: employee, manager, and administrator. Derek had administrator access. The administrator account could perform the following operations that lower-level accounts could not. 1. Modify the tip-out percentage structure. The percentages I mentioned earlier, 15% to bartenders from servers, 5% to barbacks, 3% to bussers, 4% to expediters, were not hard-coded. They were configurable. An administrator could change them at any time, and the change would apply retroactively to the current pay period unless the administrator specifically chose otherwise. 2. Make post-shift adjustments to individual tip entries. This was the module I had seen Derek using through his cracked office door. An administrator could manually adjust any employee's reported tips up or down. The system would log the adjustment, but the log was only visible to administrators. Employees saw only their final numbers. 3. Override the automatic tip calculation. In rare cases, say, when a guest disputed a gratuity or when there was a clear POS error, an administrator could override the system's calculated tip distribution and enter a manual distribution. Again, this was logged but only visible to administrators. 4. Process the weekly direct deposit payout. The administrator reviewed and approved the total card tip amounts before they were sent to the payroll processor. An administrator could modify the approved amount before submission. Armed with this knowledge, I was able to reconstruct, with a high degree of confidence, exactly how Derek was stealing from us. Method 1. Tip-out percentage manipulation. Derek would quietly increase the tip-out percentages during peak periods. For example, on a busy Saturday night, he might temporarily increase the server-to-bartender tip-out from 15% to 18%. The extra 3%, which could amount to hundreds of dollars on a high-volume night, would be credited to the bartender tip pool in TipSync. But since the actual cash payouts were calculated from the final TipSync numbers after Derek's subsequent adjustments, the extra money never made it to the bartenders. It was siphoned off. Method 2. Direct tip adjustment. After each shift, Derek would go into the post-shift adjustment module and reduce individual employees' reported tips. A server who reported $400 in tips might find that number adjusted to $360. The $40 difference would be credited to what TipSync called an unallocated surplus account. Derek could then direct that surplus wherever he wanted. Method 3. Payout suppression. When processing the weekly direct deposits, Derek would reduce the approved amounts. A bartender whose card tips for the week totaled $800 might find only $650 deposited into their account. The difference went to the same unallocated surplus. Method 4. Cash tip skimming. This was the most brazen method. On busy nights, when the bar was 3 deep and the floor was a chaos of tickets and orders, Derek would physically remove cash from the tip envelopes before handing them out. He controlled the cash box. He counted the envelopes. Nobody double-checked his count. A $20 bill here, a $50 there. It was almost invisible. I estimated, based on my analysis of my own TipSync data, combined with the testimony of other employees, that Derek was stealing approximately $8,000 to $12,000 per month from the staff. Over 5 years, that was roughly $500,000 to $720,000, more than $500,000. That was the number that changed this from a personal grievance to something much bigger. Phase 4. Building the coalition. Objective: recruit key personnel as allies and establish a coordinated response plan. Knowing the truth and proving the truth are two different things. I had strong circumstantial evidence and my own detailed records, but TipSync's internal adjustment logs, the smoking gun that would show exactly what Derek changed and when, were only accessible through the administrator account. I needed those logs. I also needed allies. Going to the owner or the labor board as a single disgruntled employee with a spreadsheet was a recipe for being dismissed as a malcontent with an axe to grind. I needed corroboration. I needed multiple voices telling the same story. But I had to be extremely careful about how I recruited. Derek was not stupid. He had survived 5 years of theft without detection. He was alert to threats. If word got back to him that I was asking questions or organizing people, he could destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or simply fire everyone involved and replace them. I identified 3 key allies. The first was Marcus Washington. Marcus was 36 years old, a 12-year veteran of the Portland restaurant industry, and the most senior bartender at Ember and Oak after me in terms of tenure. He was also the most widely respected person on the staff. When Marcus spoke, people listened. He had a calm, steady demeanor that commanded respect without demanding it. I approached Marcus on a Wednesday afternoon, our mutual day off. We met at a coffee shop on Hawthorne Boulevard, far from the restaurant. I brought my laptop with my spreadsheets. I brought my moleskin notebook, and I laid it all out. Marcus listened without interrupting for about 20 minutes. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he said 4 words. I knew it. I knew something was wrong. I never had the skills to prove it. You're telling me you can. I can, but I need your help. Whatever you need. The second ally was Sandra Chen, the assistant manager. Sandra was 29, sharp, detail-oriented, and she had been increasingly frustrated with Derek for months over issues that had nothing to do with tips, scheduling conflicts, inventory discrepancies, the way he spoke to staff. She was already sympathetic. She was also in a unique position because she had partial access to the back-office systems. She couldn't access TipSync's admin functions, but she could access the Aloha POS reports, which included total sales data, total tip data, and server performance metrics. I approached Sandra carefully. I didn't show her everything at first. I asked her a seemingly innocent question about the discrepancy between the Aloha tip reports and the TipSync distributions. Hey Sandra, I've been trying to reconcile my personal tip tracking with the Aloha end-of-night reports, and I'm noticing the numbers don't quite match the TipSync payouts. Do you ever look at those reports together? Sandra looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the moment a locked door clicks open. All the time, she said. I've brought it up to Derek 3 times in the last year. He told me it was a known synchronization issue between Aloha and TipSync, and that they were working on a software patch. Did you ever follow up with TipSync directly? I tried once. They said there was no known synchronization issue and asked me to have our administrator contact them. Derek is the administrator. When I told him, he said he'd handle it. He never mentioned it again. I showed Sandra my spreadsheets that afternoon. She went pale, then she went angry, then she said, "What do you need me to do?" The third ally was Priya Kapoor, the former server who was now in nursing school. Priya was important because she was a former employee with first-hand experience of the shortages, and she had no current relationship with Derek that he could leverage. She couldn't be fired. She couldn't be scheduled for bad shifts. She was untouchable. I met Priya at a Thai restaurant near Osu, where she was doing her clinical rotations. I explained the situation. I asked if she would be willing to provide a sworn written statement about the tip discrepancies she had experienced during her 2 years at Ember and Oak. Absolutely, she said. I always wondered. I always knew something was off. I just didn't have the energy to fight it while I was working there and going to school. I eventually collected written statements from 8 current employees and 5 former employees. Each statement followed the same format: a description of their employment dates, their typical earnings, the discrepancies they had observed, and any specific instances they could recall. I drafted the statements myself to ensure consistency and legal precision, and each person reviewed and signed their own. I also had Sandra pull Aloha POS reports for the previous 12 months. These reports showed total daily sales, total daily tips by employee, and total daily tip outs. I cross-referenced these with my own TipSync export data and with the testimony of other employees. The Aloha numbers consistently showed higher tip totals than the TipSync payout numbers. The difference, the leakage, as I called it, averaged between 8 and 15% of total daily tips. On a day when the service staff collectively earned $6,000 in tips, Derek was skimming between $480 and $900. Every single day. Phase 5. Engaging legal counsel. Objective: establish legal strategy and ensure compliance with state labor law reporting requirements. Before going to the owner or the labor board, I needed to understand my legal position. I was not a lawyer. I was an accountant. The two professions share a respect for evidence and documentation, but the law has its own logic, and I didn't want to make a move that would compromise the case. I contacted an employment law attorney named Catherine Reyes through a referral from a family friend. Catherine had been practicing labor law in Oregon for 15 years and specialized in wage theft cases. She agreed to meet with me for a free initial consultation. I brought a printed copy of my entire analysis, 63 pages of spreadsheets, charts, and narrative explanation. Catherine read through it in silence for about 30 minutes while I sat in her office across from a bookshelf filled with legal binders and a framed print of the Portland skyline. When she looked up, her expression was not surprise. It was the expression of someone who had seen this before. "This is remarkably well documented," she said, "better than most of what crosses my desk. But I need to be straightforward with you about a few things." "Tell me?" First, under Oregon law, specifically ORS 653.055, an employer is required to pay all wages owed to an employee no later than the next regular payday after the wages are earned. Tips are considered wages under Oregon law. What you're describing is systematic wage theft, which is a violation of both state statute and federal law under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Second, Oregon has a statute of limitations on wage claims, 2 years for standard claims, but 3 years if the violation is willful. Based on what you've shown me, this is clearly willful, which means the full 3-year window applies for each employee. However, your records only go back 3 years for yourself. Former employees from earlier periods may have difficulty establishing damages without records. Third, and this is critical, you need to file a complaint with the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries, commonly known as BOLI. BOLI is the state agency responsible for enforcing wage and hour laws. They have the authority to investigate, subpoena records, and order restitution. A bully complaint also puts legal pressure on the employer, because bully can assess civil penalties in addition to back wages owed. What about criminal charges? That's a possibility, but it's the DA's call, not yours. What I can tell you is that theft of this magnitude, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years, absolutely qualifies as felony theft under Oregon law. ORS 164.055 defines second-degree theft as property valued at $100 or more. ORS 164.057 defines first-degree theft as property valued at $1,000 or more in certain circumstances. This case involves sums that would qualify for Measure 11 sentencing if prosecuted. Measure 11. For those not familiar with Oregon law, Measure 11 is a 1994 ballot initiative that established mandatory minimum sentences for certain crimes. First-degree theft under Measure 11 carries a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison. Catherine outlined a strategy. File the bully complaint simultaneously with presenting the evidence to Richard Zhang, the owner. The dual approach would prevent Zhang from burying the evidence or closing ranks with Derek, because bully's involvement would create an independent investigative thread that Zhang could not control. Catherine also advised me to request that TipSync Pro preserve all records related to Ember and Oak's account, including the administrator-level adjustment logs. She drafted a preservation letter that I could send to TipSync's legal department. The total cost for Catherine's representation, if the case proceeded to litigation or settlement, would be handled on contingency. She would take 30% of any recovery. Given the potential recovery amount, which we estimated at between $500,000 and $1 million when accounting for all current and former employees, damages, penalties, and interest, the contingency arrangement made sense for everyone. I left Catherine's office with a clear operational plan and a stack of legal documents. Phase 6. The TipSync Records Retrieval. Objective: secure the complete administrative audit trail from TipSync Pro before the subject is aware of the investigation. The preservation letter to TipSync was sent on a Monday. By Wednesday, I had a response from their compliance department confirming that all records for the Ember and Oak account had been flagged and preserved. This was critical because TipSync's standard data retention policy only kept detailed adjustment logs for 18 months. Anything older would have been lost. But here is where a small piece of luck, or perhaps just good timing, intervened. TipSync had recently upgraded their backup systems, and as part of the upgrade, they had migrated all historical records to a new long-term archival storage. The full 5-year history of the Ember and Oak account, including every administrator-level adjustment, every percentage change, every payout override, was preserved. Catherine served TipSync with a formal subpoena, authorized under Oregon's wage theft investigation statutes, and within 2 weeks, we received a complete data export. The data was devastating. I spent 3 days analyzing the TipSync archive. I worked in my apartment, surrounded by printed spreadsheets and empty coffee cups, building a timeline that stretched back to the restaurant's opening week. Here is what the data showed. Derek Holland had made his first fraudulent adjustment on September 14th, 5 years ago, the 3rd week of Ember and Oak's operation. The adjustment was small. He reduced the tip payout for a server named Lauren by $12.37. The adjustment was logged as POS reconciliation correction. Over the following 5 years, Derek made a total of 4,217 individual adjustments to employee tip records. The adjustments varied in size from under $10 to over $800 on a single entry. The total amount diverted through these adjustments was $612,431. In addition to the adjustments, Derek had modified the tip-out percentage structure 23 times. Each modification temporarily increased one or more tip-out percentages, creating surplus funds that were then redirected to the unallocated surplus account. The total amount diverted through percentage manipulation was an additional $97,218. The weekly direct deposit suppressions accounted for another $204,856 over the 5-year period. The total verified amount stolen, $914,505. $914,000, stolen from 37 different employees over 5 years, funneled through a cloud software platform into Derek Holland's personal accounts. I sat at my desk and stared at that number for a very long time. Then I got back to work. Because the job wasn't done. Phase 7, Coordinated Execution. Objective: present the complete evidence package to the restaurant owner and the state labor board simultaneously, ensuring maximum impact and minimum opportunity for evidence destruction or countermeasures. Timing was everything. I needed to present the evidence to Richard Zhang and file the Boley complaint at the same time. If Zhang learned about the investigation before Boley was involved, there was a risk, however small, that he might try to protect Derek or minimize the damage to protect the restaurant's reputation. Boley's involvement would prevent that. If Boley learned about it before Zhang, there was a risk that Boley might contact the restaurant directly, tipping off Derek before I had a chance to present the evidence to Zhang in a controlled manner. The solution was a synchronized operation. Catherine would file the Boley complaint electronically at precisely 9 a.m. on a Thursday. I would present the evidence to Richard Zhang in person at 9:15 a.m. the same day. The 15-minute gap ensured that by the time Zhang was informed, Boley's complaint was already in the system, and an investigation was formally open. I prepared the evidence package for Zhang with the same meticulous care I had applied to the entire investigation. It contained 1. An executive summary, 2 pages, double-spaced, outlining the nature and scope of the theft in plain, non-technical language. 2. A detailed financial analysis showing the total amount stolen, broken down by method, by month, and by affected employee. Charts, graphs, pivot tables, the full accountant treatment. 3. The complete tip sync adjustment log, highlighting the 4,217 fraudulent entries. 4. Written statements from all 13 current and former employees who had provided testimony. 5. A legal memo from Catherine Reyes outlining the applicable statutes, the potential criminal liability, and the recommended course of action. 6. A cover letter from me, personally, explaining why I had conducted the investigation the way I had and what I was asking Zhang to do. The ask was specific. I wanted Derek terminated immediately. I wanted the restaurant to cooperate fully with the Boley investigation. I wanted full restitution for all affected employees, including former employees, and I wanted the restaurant to implement new safeguards, specifically, multi-administrator access to TipSync with dual approval requirements for any adjustments, and a monthly independent audit of tip distributions. I printed 3 copies of the complete package, one for Zhang, one for Catherine, one for my own records, and had them bound at a print shop on Burnside. 67 pages each. Professional quality. The night before the execution, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous about the confrontation with Zhang. I had rehearsed that conversation a dozen times in my head. I couldn't sleep because I was thinking about all the people who had been affected. Lauren, who had been Derek's first victim and had left the industry entirely. James, the former barback, who was now working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Devante, who had missed 2 rent payments last year and had no idea why, because his tip earnings should have been more than enough. Money is not just money when you work in restaurants. It's food and rent and healthcare and student loans and the ability to take a day off without panic. Derek hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen security and peace of mind from people who were already living on the financial edge. The execution. Thursday, April 17th. I arrived at Ember and Oak at 8:45 a.m. The restaurant was closed. We didn't open for lunch service until 11:30 on weekdays. I knew Derek typically arrived around 10 a.m. to prepare for the lunch shift. This gave me a 30-minute window alone with Zhang, who I had scheduled a financial review meeting with under the pretense of discussing potential cost-saving measures for the bar program. Richard Zhang was 61 years old. A first-generation Chinese-American entrepreneur who had built a small restaurant empire in the Pacific Northwest, 3 high-end establishments, a catering company, and a food truck. Ember and Oak was his flagship. He was a quiet, deliberate man who chose his words carefully and expected others to do the same. Zhang's office was on the second floor of the building, above the main dining room. It was a modest space: a desk, 2 chairs, a window overlooking Monroe Street, a single framed photograph of the restaurant's grand opening. Zhang was already there when I arrived, sipping tea from a ceramic cup. "Thank you for coming in, Alex," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "You mentioned you had some ideas about bar costs?" I sat down, placed the bound evidence package on his desk, and said, "Mr. Zhang, I need you to read something. It's important that you read it before I say anything else. This is going to take about 15 minutes of your time, and I need you to read every page." Zhang looked at the package. He looked at me. He picked up his reading glasses from the desk and opened to the first page. For the next 12 minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of pages. I watched Zhang's face as he read. He started calm, professionally engaged, the way a business owner looks when reviewing a proposal. By page 5, the executive summary, his jaw had tightened. By page 12, the financial analysis with the total loss figure, his hands were gripping the edges of the document. By page 20, the individual adjustment logs showing hundreds of entries, his face had gone from red to white. He read the entire package in silence. When he finished, he closed the binder, removed his glasses, and placed them on the desk very carefully. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "Since February of last year. I've been documenting it since then." "And you came to me now? Not earlier?" "I came to you now because now I have proof that would hold up in court. If I had come to you a year ago with suspicions but no evidence, there was a risk that Derek would have been alerted and would have destroyed records. TipSync only retains detailed logs for 18 months. I needed to secure those logs before he could tamper with them." Zhang was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have known Derek for 12 years. He was my operations manager at my first restaurant. I trusted him with everything. I understand, and I'm sorry." $914,000, he said the number slowly, like he was weighing each word. "Yes, sir." "From my employees?" "Yes, sir." He stood up, walked to the window, stared out at Monroe Street for almost a full minute. Then he turned back to me and said, "What do you need from me?" I told him, "Terminate Derek immediately, cooperate with Boley, full restitution, new safeguards." "I've already filed a complaint with the Bureau of Labor and Industries this morning," I said. "The investigation is formally open. They'll be in touch within the week." Zhang nodded slowly. "You planned this very carefully." "I did. I'm an accountant, Mr. Zhang. This is what I do." He almost smiled. "Almost. What about the other employees? Do they know? A small group of us have been working on this together, Marcus, Sandra, and several others. We have written statements from 13 current and former employees. I want to see those statements." "They're in the package, Section 4. He opened the binder again and flipped to the statements. He read them one by one. When he finished, he closed the binder again and said, "Derek will not be in this building tomorrow. I will handle it personally today." "I appreciate that, Mr. Zhang. I also want you to know that my attorney, Catherine Reyes, is available to discuss the restitution process at your convenience. We believe the total recovery amount, including back wages, statutory penalties, and interest, will be significant. But our priority is making the affected employees whole." Zhang sat down heavily in his chair. "I will call my attorney, and I will call Ms. Reyes, and I will call Derek and tell him to come in this afternoon so I can do this face to face." I stood up, extended my hand. Zhang shook it. His grip was firm and his eyes were wet. "Thank you, Alex. I should have caught this myself. I should have had controls in place. This is my responsibility as the owner." "With respect, sir, Derek was very good at what he did. The system was designed to be opaque to everyone except the administrator. You trusted the wrong person, but the system failed too. That's fixable." I left his office at 9:47 a.m. As I walked down the stairs to the main floor, I passed the back hallway that led to Derek's office. The door was closed. The light was off. He wasn't there yet. By the time he arrived at 10:15, the wheels were already in motion. The aftermath, Phase 8, and beyond. Derek Holland was terminated that afternoon. According to Sandra, who was present for the meeting at Zhang's request, Derek's reaction was not what anyone expected. He didn't deny it. He didn't get angry. He sat in Zhang's office, listened to the accusation, and said, "I was wondering when someone would figure it out." That statement, "I was wondering when someone would figure it out," haunted me for weeks. It meant he knew, on some level, that this day would come. He had been living with the knowledge that his theft was ongoing and unsustainable, and he had kept going anyway. The arrogance of it, the indifference to the people he was hurting, it was breathtaking. Zhang's attorney and Catherine Reyes negotiated a restitution agreement over the following 3 months. The total settlement amount was $1.4 million. This included $914,000 in back wages, $312,000 in statutory penalties and interest under Oregon wage law, and the remainder in legal fees and additional compensation for the hardship caused to the affected employees. The money came from 2 sources. Zhang's commercial liability insurance covered a portion of it, roughly $600,000. The rest came from Derek personally, through a civil lawsuit that Zhang filed against him concurrently with the restitution process. Derek had, apparently, been investing most of the stolen money in a series of brokerage accounts. The accounts were frozen by court order within a week of his termination. Boley's investigation confirmed all of my findings. The investigator assigned to the case, a thorough woman named Dorothy Kim, told me privately that it was one of the most well-documented wage theft cases she had seen in her 18 years with the Bureau. Usually we get a handwritten note from a single employee saying my boss didn't pay me right. This was a forensic accounting presentation. The Washington County District Attorney's Office also opened a criminal investigation. Derek was indicted on 17 counts of first-degree theft and 1 count of racketeering. The racketeering charge was unusual for a wage theft case, but the DA's office argued that the systematic, ongoing nature of the scheme, involving multiple victims, multiple methods, and a 5-year duration, met the legal standard for engaging in a corrupt criminal enterprise. Derek pled guilty to 12 counts of first-degree theft in exchange for the racketeering charge being dropped. He was sentenced to 36 months in the Oregon Department of Corrections, with credit for time served awaiting trial. He was also ordered to pay full restitution as part of his sentence. The employees received their settlement checks in September of that year. I remember the day they arrived. Zhang called a staff meeting. The first all-staff meeting Derek had ever let him hold, I realized, and handed out envelopes. Each envelope contained a check and a personal letter from Zhang apologizing for what had happened under his ownership. The reactions were varied. Some people cried. Marcus just stared at his check for a long time and then shook Zhang's hand. Devante, who had been one of the hardest hit, he had worked at Ember and Oak for 3 years and had over $40,000 stolen from him, immediately called his mother. I could hear him through the door of the office. "Mom, I'm coming to visit. I'm buying the tickets. I don't care what it costs." My own check was for $127,000. That was my share of the settlement after legal fees and after the proportional distribution based on each employee's documented losses. It was more money than I had ever received at one time in my life. I did not buy a condo. Instead, I used part of the money to enroll in a master's program in forensic accounting at Portland State University, because the experience of investigating Derek had shown me something about myself that I hadn't fully understood before. I was good at this. Not just competent, genuinely, exceptionally good. The ability to see patterns in data, to build cases methodically, to think several steps ahead of an adversary. These were skills that had value far beyond a single restaurant tip theft case. But there is one more part of this story that I want to tell, because it's the part I think about most. 3 months after Derek's termination, I received a phone call from a woman named Lauren. She was the first person Derek had stolen from, that $12.37 adjustment on September 14th, 5 years ago. She had left the restaurant industry after her time at Ember and Oak and was working as a medical billing specialist. She had seen a news article about the case. It had been covered by the Oregonian, Willamette Week, and even got a brief mention on a local TV news segment. "I read about what happened," Lauren said, "about Derek, about the investigation, about the settlement." "Yes," I said. I need you to know something. When I was working at Ember and Oak, I thought I was bad at my job. I thought I was a bad server, because I could never make the money I thought I should be making, and I couldn't figure out why. I started doubting myself. I started thinking maybe I just wasn't cut out for the industry. That's why I left. She paused. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Finding out that it wasn't me, that it was him, that I wasn't crazy or bad at my job, that means more to me than the money. The money is great. Don't get me wrong. But knowing that I wasn't wrong about myself, that's everything. I didn't know what to say. I said, "You weren't wrong. You were never wrong." Thank you for figuring it out. That phone call crystallized something for me about why this whole endeavor had felt so necessary. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the gaslighting. Derek's theft didn't just take dollars from people's pockets. It took confidence from their sense of self. It made hard-working, talented people doubt their own perceptions and their own worth. And that kind of theft leaves a mark that money alone can't repair. Closing assessment and lessons learned. I want to close this out with some practical takeaways, because if you're reading this and something feels off about your own tip situation, I want you to know what to do. 1. Trust your instincts. If the numbers don't feel right, they probably aren't. You don't need an accounting degree to notice a pattern, you just need to pay attention. 2. Document everything. Write down your sales, your tips, and your payouts. Every shift. Use your phone, use a notebook, use whatever works. The simple act of recording creates a paper trail that can be invaluable later. 3. Don't confront the suspect directly until you have evidence. This is the hardest part, because the natural instinct when someone is stealing from you is to confront them. Resist that instinct. Confrontation without evidence gives the thief time to destroy records, recruit allies, and construct counter-narratives. 4. Know your rights. Every state has wage and hour laws that protect tipped employees. In Oregon, BOLI is the agency that handles these complaints. In other states, it might be the Department of Labor or a similar agency. Look it up. Know the process. 5. Find allies. There is strength in numbers. A single complaint can be dismissed. 13 complaints backed by financial evidence and legal representation cannot. 6. Get legal help. Many employment attorneys work on contingency for wage theft cases. The initial consultation is often free. You have nothing to lose by talking to a lawyer and everything to gain. 7. Remember that you are not crazy. If you consistently earn less than you expect, and the discrepancy is always in one direction, always less, never more, something is wrong. It is not your imagination. It is not bad luck. It is not your math skills. Something is wrong, and you have the right to find out what. Ember and Oak is still open. Zhang implemented all of the safeguards I recommended: dual administrator access, monthly independent audits, and a transparent tip distribution system that every employee can review in real time. He also hired a new general manager, a woman named Keiko Tanaka, who is everything Derek was not. Open, collaborative, respectful. The staff morale, Zhang told me recently, has never been higher. Marcus is still bartending at Ember and Oak. He's the bar manager now, a position that came with a significant raise and a seat at the restaurant's management committee. He told me last month that the bar program revenue is up 18% since Keiko took over, because the staff actually trusts the system now and works with more energy and confidence. Sandra left Ember and Oak 6 months after the investigation. She's now the general manager of a new restaurant that Zhang is opening in the Pearl District. She called the new place Integrity, which I thought was a bit on the nose, but she earned the right to be obvious about it. As for me, I finished my master's degree in forensic accounting and now work for a consulting firm that specializes in financial fraud investigation. I spend my days doing essentially what I did at Ember and Oak, but on a much larger scale. Corporate embezzlement, insurance fraud, Ponzi schemes. I love it. But I still think about that night, the slow Tuesday in November, when Marcus stared at his phone and said, 211. That was the moment the whole thing started. A single number that didn't add up. A single discrepancy that most people would have ignored. I didn't ignore it. And neither should you. Epilogue. I went back to Ember and Oak last month for the first time since the investigation. It was a Friday night, and the bar was packed. Marcus saw me come in and poured me an old-fashioned, without asking, Rittenhouse rye, Angostura, a single large ice cube, orange peel expressed over the top. He remembered. The bar looked the same. The same mahogany top, the same steel shelving lined with bottles that cost more than most people's car payments. The same exposed brick wall behind the back bar, warm and orange in the low light. But something was different. The energy. The staff moved with a lightness I didn't recognize. People were laughing, not the performative, customer service kind of laughing, but the real kind. The kind that happens when you actually enjoy where you are and who you're working with. Keiko was on the floor, making her rounds. She stopped by the bar, said hello, and asked how my new job was going. I told her it was going well. She smiled and moved on to the next table. I sat at the end of the bar, nursing my drink, and I thought about Derek. I don't know where he is now. I know he served roughly 18 months of his 36-month sentence before being released on good behavior. I know the civil judgment against him, the restitution order, is still active, and that Zhang's attorney is pursuing collection. I know that Derek's brokerage accounts, once worth several $100,000, were liquidated as part of the settlement. I know that Derek lost his home, his truck, and reportedly his marriage. I do not feel sorry for him. I want to be clear about that. He made a choice. Thousands of choices, actually, each one a deliberate decision to take money that wasn't his. And he made those choices every single day for 5 years. He looked his employees in the eye, shook their hands, wished them a good night, and then went to his office and stole from them. But I also don't celebrate his downfall. There is something sad about a person who had a good job, a good salary, the respect of his peers, and still decided it wasn't enough. Whatever internal calculus led Derek to start stealing and keep stealing, greed, insecurity, entitlement, some toxic combination of all three, it ultimately cost him everything. That is the nature of theft. It always costs more than it yields. Always. Marcus finished his shift at midnight. He sat down next to me at the bar, and I bought him a drink. We talked about nothing important for a while. The Blazers, a new whiskey he'd been trying, the ridiculous number of lavender-infused cocktails that trendy bars were pushing these days. Then he said, "You know what I think about sometimes? All those nights I went home feeling like I'd done something wrong, like I wasn't good enough, like the money I was making was the most I deserved, even though it didn't match what I knew I was earning. That feeling, that's what he took from me that I can't get back, even with the settlement." "I know," I said. "But then I think about the fact that you didn't let him get away with it. You could have just quit. You could have found another bar job and moved on. But you stayed, and you fought, and you did the work. That means something. It was never just about me." "I know, that's why it means something." We finished our drinks. Marcus closed out the bar. I walked home through downtown Portland in the rain, because it's always raining in Portland, and I thought about the moleskin notebook that started all of this. It's on a shelf in my office now, next to my CPA certificate and my master's degree. A small, battered, alcohol-stained notebook full of numbers that changed 37 people's lives. If you're reading this and you're in a situation where something doesn't add up, open a notebook, start writing. The numbers don't lie. And eventually, if you're patient and careful and disciplined, the truth comes out. It always does. Story 2. A corporation stole my open source code. I open-sourced their embarrassing secrets. In April of 2022, I pushed the final commit for version 3.2.0 of libquery, my open-source SQL query optimization engine. I'd been working on it for 4 years at that point, ever since my second year of graduate school at MIT. The library implemented a novel approach to query plan optimization using a cost model based on dynamic programming with memoized sub-expression analysis. It was, by most objective metrics, a significant piece of work. The GitHub repository had accumulated 4,200 stars. The NPM package was pulling 180,000 weekly downloads. Companies ranging from early-stage startups to mid-tier SaaS platforms had integrated it into their data pipelines. I released libquery under the GNU General Public License, version 3.0. This was a deliberate and carefully considered decision. I'd studied open source licensing extensively during my graduate research. I understood the implications of each major license family. I chose the GPL specifically because I wanted to ensure that improvements and derivative works would remain open and accessible to the broader community. The GPL isn't complicated in its core mechanism. If you distribute a work that incorporates GPL licensed code, you must also distribute the source code of your work under the same license. You must preserve copyright notices. You must provide a copy of the license. You must make it clear that the software is licensed under the GPL. These aren't suggestions. They're conditions of the license grant. Without compliance, you have no legal right to distribute the software at all. I placed a prominent license file in the repository root. I included SpeedyX license headers in every source file. The README contained a dedicated section explaining the licensing terms and what they meant for downstream users. The NPM package metadata explicitly declared GPL 3.0 only as the license identifier. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for plausible misunderstanding. 6 months later, in October 2022, I received a Slack message from a former colleague named Danica Patel. Danica had left her previous role at a mid-size analytics firm and joined a company called VantageCore Systems as a senior back-end engineer. VantageCore was a well-funded enterprise data platform that had been making waves in the tech press. They'd raised a $140 million Series C at a $1.2 billion valuation earlier that year. "Hey," Danica wrote, "I think VantageCore is using libquery in their product, like internally integrated. But I don't see any attribution anywhere, and there's definitely no source code being released. Just thought you should know." I appreciated the tip, but I didn't immediately assume malice. Compliance failures in large organizations are often the result of institutional ignorance rather than deliberate theft. A developer might pull in a library without checking the license. Legal might not review dependencies. The left hand frequently doesn't know what the right hand is doing in companies with hundreds of engineers. So I approached it systematically. My first step was to verify the claim before taking any action. I navigated to VantageCore's product documentation and downloaded their technical white paper. I examined their public API documentation. I looked for any mention of libquery, my name, or GPL compliance in their documentation, website, or terms of service. I found nothing. My second step was more technical. VantageCore offered a downloadable enterprise edition of their platform. It was distributed as a Docker image, which meant I could inspect its contents. I pulled the image from their private registry using a trial license I obtained through a shell company email address. This is a common and legal practice for security research. I extracted the file system layers of the Docker image using standard tools. I then performed a comprehensive scan of the extracted files. I wasn't looking for just the library name. That would be trivially easy to obfuscate. I was looking for structural fingerprints. libquery has a distinctive internal architecture. The Query Planner module uses a specific class hierarchy rooted in an abstract class called baseQueryNode. The cost estimation engine implements a particular pattern of memoization using a custom least recently used cache implementation. The SQL parser generates a specific abstract syntax tree structure, with node types like select statement node, join clause node, and predicate node. These are structural signatures. They're as distinctive as a fingerprint, and they're extremely difficult to eliminate through superficial renaming or refactoring. I found them all. The classes were there. The memoization cache was there. The AST node hierarchy was there, with identical inheritance patterns and nearly identical method signatures. Some variable names had been changed, and a few methods had been moved between classes. But the fundamental architecture was unmistakable. To be thorough, I wrote an automated comparison tool. It parsed both my public libquery source code and the deobfuscated JavaScript from VantageCore's product. It computed a structural similarity score based on abstract syntax tree comparison, call graph analysis, and dependency structure matching. The similarity score was 0.87 on a normalized scale of 0 to 1. For reference, independent implementations of similar functionality typically score between 0.2 and 0.4. Scores above 0.7 are generally considered strong evidence of code derivation. A score of 0.87 indicated that VantageCore's code was directly derived from libquery, with only superficial modifications. I documented everything: screenshots of the Docker image layers, diff outputs from my comparison tool, copies of the relevant source files extracted from their product, download timestamps, and license agreement records. I then drafted a formal email to VantageCore's legal department. I kept it professional and specific. I identified myself as the copyright holder of libquery. I described the GPL 3.0 license under which it was distributed. I explained that their product appeared to incorporate libquery without compliance with the license terms. I requested that they either release the source code of their product under the GPL or cease distribution. I sent the email on November 3, 2022. I used certified mail for a physical copy and email for a digital copy, addressed to their general counsel and their VP of engineering. I received an automated acknowledgement email. That was the last communication I got from them for 6 weeks. On December 15, 2022, I sent a follow-up email. Same recipients, same tone, but with a firmer deadline. I gave them 30 days to come into compliance before I would pursue formal enforcement action. No response. On January 20, 2023, I sent a final notice. I outlined the specific GPL violations, referenced the relevant sections of the license text, and stated that I was prepared to take legal action. I CC'd their CEO, their board members I could identify from SEC filings, and their primary venture capital investors. I got a form letter response from a paralegal, stating that VantageCore Systems takes intellectual property matters seriously and will review your concerns. No substance. No commitment, no timeline. At this point, I had exhausted the reasonable pre-litigation steps. A less systematic person might have immediately filed a lawsuit, but I'm an engineer. I believe in understanding the full scope of a problem before attempting to solve it, and something about this situation bothered me. VantageCore was a billion-dollar company with a legal team of at least 12 people, based on their LinkedIn profiles. They had outside counsel from a top-tier firm. They knew what the GPL was. They knew what the consequences of non-compliance were. The fact that they were stonewalling me, a solo developer, rather than simply releasing the relevant source code, suggested something more systemic. Maybe libquery wasn't the only open-source project they'd appropriated. This hypothesis changed the entire nature of the investigation. I was no longer looking at a single license violation. I was looking at what could be a pattern of systematic intellectual property theft. I spent the next 3 weeks conducting a deep analysis of VantageCore's product. I extracted every JavaScript file from their Docker image. I cataloged every dependency, every internal module, every piece of code that wasn't clearly written from scratch for their application. I identified 847 distinct JavaScript modules in their distribution. Of these, 312 were standard third-party libraries with proper attribution in a package.json file. That left 535 modules that were either proprietary or of unknown origin. I then focused on those 535 modules. For each one, I analyzed its structure, coding patterns, comment style, and functionality. I was looking for fingerprints that might match known open-source projects. This was a massive undertaking. To scale the analysis, I wrote a more sophisticated comparison engine. It could take a JavaScript module and compare it against a database of known open-source projects scraped from GitHub. The comparison used multiple heuristics: structural similarity, n-gram analysis of code tokens, comment pattern matching, and function signature comparison. I seeded the database with the top 5,000 most starred JavaScript repositories on GitHub, focusing on libraries related to data processing, database connectivity, API frameworks, authentication, and utility functions, the domains most relevant to VantageCore's product. The results were staggering. I found evidence of GPL-licensed code from 7 different open-source projects embedded in VantageCore's product. Not just libquery, 7. Here's the full list. 1. libquery, my project. GPL 3.0, SQL Query Optimization Engine. 2. DataPipe.js by Marcus Chen, GPL 3.0, Stream Processing and ETL Pipeline Framework. 3. Secure Vault by the Open Crypto Foundation, GPL 3.0, Client-Side Encryption and Key Management Library. 4. GraphNav by Yuki Tanaka, GPL 2.0, Graph Database Traversal and Shortest Path Computation. 5. Authforge by Rajiv Mehta, AGPL 3.0, Authentication Token Generation and Validation Framework. 6. Logstream by Elena Voss, GPL 3.0, Structured Logging and Real-Time Log Aggregation. 7. Schema Migrate by the OpenDB Tools Collective, GPL 2.0, Database Schema Versioning and Migration Engine. 7 projects, 5 different copyright holders, 2 different GPL versions, 1 AgPel project, and not a single one had received attribution, source code disclosure, or license compliance from VantageCore. The combined similarity scores ranged from 0.79 to 0.91. Every single one was above the threshold I'd established for derivation confidence. I sat in my home office for about 20 minutes after compiling that list, just staring at the data. Not out of anger, though I was certainly angry. I was processing the implications. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't one developer making a mistake. This was institutional. A billion-dollar company had built a significant portion of their product on stolen open-source code, and they'd been doing it for what appeared to be years. The next step was clear. I needed to contact the other copyright holders. But I needed to be careful about how I did it. I couldn't just blast out emails to strangers saying, "Hey, I think a corporation stole your code." That would be dismissed as crank communication. I needed to present the evidence in a way that was credible, verifiable, and actionable. I started with DataPipe.js. Marcus Chen was the sole maintainer, and his project had 12,000 GitHub stars. His contact information was in the package.json file and on his personal website. He was a staff engineer at a FANG company. I sent Marcus a detailed email on February 14, 2023. I introduced myself, explained my situation with libquery, and described what I'd found regarding DataPipe.js. I attached a technical appendix with the specific evidence, file comparison tables, similarity scores, and annotated code excerpts showing the structural parallels between his open-source code and the code I'd extracted from VantageCore's product. Marcus responded within 4 hours. "Holy shit," he wrote. "I always wondered why their stream processing syntax looked so familiar. I just thought they'd hired someone who liked my API design. Can you send me the raw extraction?" I sent him everything. 2 days later, he confirmed my analysis. He'd independently verified the structural similarities and agreed that VantageCore's code was clearly derived from DataPipe.js. I then reached out to Yuki Tanaka for GraphNav. Yuki was a researcher at the University of Tokyo and was notably more cautious. She asked detailed questions about my methodology, my comparison tools, and the chain of custody for the evidence. I answered everything transparently. After a week of back and forth, she confirmed the derivation and agreed to participate in a coordinated response. Rajiv Mehta of Authforge was the quickest to respond. 37 minutes after my initial email. He was furious. He'd suspected for over a year that something was wrong, based on a bug in VantageCore's authentication documentation that matched a known quirk in Authforge's token format. But he'd never had the resources or the evidence to pursue it. Now he did. Elena Voss of Logstream was a freelance developer based in Berlin. She was initially skeptical, but asked good technical questions. I walked her through my analysis methodology step by step. She asked if she could run my comparison tool herself. I sent her the source code. She ran it, confirmed the results, and joined the group. The Open Crypto Foundation, maintainers of Secure Vault, had a formal governance structure with a board of directors and a legal committee. I sent my evidence to their executive director, a woman named Sandra Okonkwo. Sandra was a former intellectual property lawyer, and she understood the legal implications immediately. She escalated to their board within 48 hours and received authorization to participate. The OpenDB Tools Collective, maintainers of Schema Migrate, was the most unusual case. It was a true collective, no single copyright holder, but rather a group of 11 contributors who jointly held copyright. Their project used a contributor license agreement that granted each contributor equal rights. I had to contact all 11 contributors and get consensus. This took the better part of 3 weeks. But ultimately, 9 of the 11 agreed to participate, and the other 2 abstained rather than objected. By March 15, 2023, I had assembled a coalition of 7 copyright holders, representing all 7 affected projects, who were prepared to take coordinated action against VantageCore systems. We set up a private Slack workspace. I named it Project Lighthouse, a reference to the idea that open-source licenses exist to illuminate the path for others, and that enforcing them keeps the light on. Our first order of business was to establish a shared legal strategy. Sandra Okonkwo, with her IP law background, took the lead on this. She drafted a framework document that outlined our collective position. The legal theory was straightforward. Under the GPL, VantageCore had no license to distribute any of the 7 projects. Period. The license was conditioned on compliance with its terms. Non-compliance meant the license grant was void. Without a valid license, VantageCore was engaging in copyright infringement for each project. Copyright infringement is a strict liability offense. Intent doesn't matter. Whether they knew about the GPL or not is irrelevant. They distributed the code, they didn't comply with the license, and they had no other legal basis for distribution. The damages potential was enormous. Statutory damages for willful copyright infringement in the United States can reach $150,000 per work. With 7 works, and multiple copyright holders per work in some cases, the theoretical maximum statutory damages exceeded $10 million, and that was before considering actual damages, which could be calculated based on VantageCore's revenue from the product. But our goal wasn't to extract money. Our goal was compliance. We wanted VantageCore to either release the source code of their product under the GPL, as the license required, or to stop distributing it until they could replace the infringing code. The strategic calculus was interesting. Releasing the source code of their entire product would effectively destroy their business model, which was based on proprietary software licensing. But replacing the infringing code would require a massive engineering effort, since the 7 projects we'd identified formed the core of their data processing pipeline, their security layer, and their authentication system. Either way, the impact on VantageCore would be severe. Sandra recommended that we retain a single law firm to represent all copyright holders jointly. This would present a unified front and avoid the risk of VantageCore picking off individual developers with settlement offers that divided the coalition. She recommended a firm called Keller and Associates in San Francisco, which specialized in intellectual property litigation and had experience with GPL enforcement. The cost of legal representation was a concern. Keller and Associates quoted a retainer of $75,000, with an estimate of $200,000 to $400,000 in total legal fees through the initial phases of litigation. This was far beyond what most individual developers could afford. We solved this through a combination of approaches. Sandra's organization, the Open Crypto Foundation, agreed to front the initial retainer from their legal defense fund. Marcus Chen and Rajiv Mehta each contributed $15,000 from personal savings. Yuki Tanaka's university agreed to provide pro bono legal research support. I contributed $10,000, which was most of my consulting savings. Elena Voss couldn't contribute financially, but volunteered to manage the coalition's communications and documentation. We also explored the possibility of working with the Software Freedom Conservancy, a nonprofit organization that provides legal support for open-source projects. They expressed interest, but ultimately decided that their current caseload prevented them from taking on a new enforcement action. However, they offered to provide amicus support if the case went to court. With legal representation secured, we moved to the next phase, building the public case. Here's something important to understand about GPL enforcement. The legal action is necessary, but the court of public opinion is often more powerful than any courtroom. Tech companies are exceptionally sensitive to reputational damage, especially when it comes to treating open-source developers poorly. A viral story about a billion-dollar company stealing code from individual developers can cause more financial damage than a lawsuit. Sandra and the attorneys at Keller and Associates recommended a specific sequence. First, send a formal demand letter to VantageCore from all copyright holders jointly. This establishes the legal record and demonstrates that we're serious. Second, if VantageCore doesn't comply within the specified timeframe, file a complaint in federal court. Third, simultaneously with the filing, release a coordinated public statement describing the violations. The demand letter was sent on April 3, 2023. It was 23 pages long, signed by all copyright holders, and notarized. It detailed each of the 7 license violations with specific code evidence. It demanded that VantageCore either release the complete source code of their VantageCore platform product under compatible open-source licenses within 30 days, or cease all distribution of the product. The letter also made clear that if VantageCore chose to cease distribution, they would still be liable for past infringement, and we reserved the right to pursue damages. We sent the letter via multiple channels: certified mail to their registered agent, email to their general counsel and CEO, and hand delivery by a process server to their headquarters in Austin, Texas. The response came on April 10, 2023, not from VantageCore's legal department, but from a PR firm called Meridian Strategic Communications. A woman named Brittany Holloway, a senior vice president at Meridian, sent an email to all of us. We understand you have concerns about VantageCore's use of certain open-source software components. The email read, in part, VantageCore is committed to ethical business practices and takes these matters seriously. We'd like to propose a call to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution that addresses your concerns while allowing VantageCore to continue serving its customers. Brittany's tone was conciliatory but carefully non-committal. She didn't acknowledge any violation. She didn't mention the GPL. She framed it as concerns rather than legal claims. This was classic corporate crisis management language. Acknowledge the existence of a problem without admitting fault. Sandra advised us not to take the call without our attorneys present. Marcus agreed. Rajiv wanted to take the call immediately and tell them what's what, but we calmed him down. Keller and Associates arranged a call for April 14, 2023. It was attended by 2 attorneys from Keller, Sandra from the Open Crypto Foundation, me as the coalition coordinator, and 2 in-house attorneys from VantageCore, plus Brittany from the PR firm. The VantageCore attorneys opened by stating that they were still reviewing the technical analysis and couldn't confirm or deny the allegations. They asked if we would be willing to accept a licensing arrangement, essentially paying us for the right to use our code under proprietary terms. This was a revealing request. If they truly believed they were in compliance with the GPL, they wouldn't need a separate licensing arrangement. The fact that they were offering to pay suggested that they knew they were in violation and were trying to buy their way out of it. Our attorneys responded that the GPL did not allow for proprietary relicensing. The code was available under the GPL and only the GPL. If VantageCore wanted to use it under different terms, they would need to negotiate with each copyright holder individually for a separate license. The VantageCore attorneys then shifted to a different tactic. They suggested that the similarities between our code and their product were coincidental and resulted from independent development to solve similar problems in the data processing space. Our attorneys responded with a detailed technical briefing. They presented the similarity scores, the structural analysis, and specific code examples where VantageCore's code contained identical error handling patterns, identical edge case behaviors, and even identical commented-out debugging code that existed in the original open-source projects. The probability of independent development producing these results was, in the words of our lead attorney, functionally 0. The call ended with VantageCore's attorneys requesting a 2-week extension to conduct a thorough internal review. Our attorneys agreed, with the explicit condition that the 30-day demand deadline would be extended by exactly 14 days, to May 17, 2023. During those 2 weeks, something interesting happened. A source inside VantageCore, I never learned their identity, leaked an internal Slack channel discussion to Donica, my original contact. The discussion showed that VantageCore's engineering leadership was aware of the GPL violations as early as 2021. They'd made a deliberate decision to use the open-source code without compliance because they calculated that the risk of enforcement was low. The reasoning, as expressed in the leaked messages, was chilling in its logic. Individual developers, they believed, rarely had the resources to pursue legal action. GPL enforcement organizations were understaffed and overworked. The worst-case scenario was a settlement that would cost less than the engineering effort required to replace the code. It was, in essence, a calculated cost-benefit analysis that treated open-source licenses as optional suggestions rather than legal obligations. Danuka forwarded the leaked messages to me. I shared them with the coalition and our attorneys. This changed the legal calculus significantly. The leaked messages demonstrated willful infringement, knowledge of the license requirements, and a deliberate decision to violate them. Willful infringement carries enhanced statutory damages and can support claims for punitive damages in some jurisdictions. It also dramatically weakens any innocent infringement defense VantageCore might try to mount. May 17, 2023, arrived. VantageCore had not complied with the demand letter. They had not released any source code. They had not ceased distribution. They had not even responded to our attorney's follow-up communications. We filed the lawsuit. Refuge, the case was filed in the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas, which had jurisdiction over VantageCore's Austin headquarters. The complaint named VantageCore Systems, Inc. as the defendant and listed all 7 copyright holders as plaintiffs. It contained 7 counts of copyright infringement, 1 for each affected project. The complaint was 67 pages long. It included detailed technical exhibits, the leaked internal messages as evidence of willful infringement, and a declaration from me describing my analysis methodology. Our attorneys also filed a motion for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction that would prevent VantageCore from continuing to distribute the infringing product while the case was pending. Now, here's where the strategy shifted, from purely legal to legal plus public. Our attorneys had advised us that the strongest position was one that combined legal pressure with public awareness. A lawsuit alone could drag on for years, but a lawsuit combined with a viral media campaign could force a much faster resolution. We prepared a coordinated media release. The timing was critical. It needed to go out immediately after the lawsuit was filed, while the news was fresh and before VantageCore's PR team could control the narrative. I drafted the core technical document. It was a 15-page PDF titled Technical Analysis, Evidence of Systematic GPL Noncompliance by VantageCore Systems. It contained the same evidence from the lawsuit, but presented in a more accessible format: code comparison tables, similarity score visualizations, a timeline of the infringement, the leaked internal messages. Sandra drafted the press statement. Marcus, Rajiv, and I were listed as the primary media contacts. The other copyright holders were included as supporting signatories. We pre-briefed 3 journalists who covered open source and technology legal issues: Sarah Chen at TechCrunch, Mike Redmond at The Verge, and Ana Gutierrez at Ars Technica. We gave them the technical document and the press statement under embargo, with the understanding that they could publish the moment the lawsuit became public record. The lawsuit was filed at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on May 18, 2023. By 9:15 a.m., our press release was live. By 10 a.m., Sarah Chen's TechCrunch article was up. Mike Redmond's piece followed at 11:30 a.m. Ana Gutierrez published a detailed technical analysis at Ars Technica at 1 p.m. The reaction was immediate and intense. Within 24 hours, the story had been picked up by dozens of media outlets. Hacker News had a thread with over 3,400 upvotes and 1,200 comments. Reddit's R from Programming had a sticky post. Twitter was saturated with commentary from developers, lawyers, and tech executives. The narrative was compelling. A group of individual open-source developers, spanning multiple countries, had banded together to hold a billion-dollar corporation accountable for stealing their work. It was David versus Goliath, but with source code instead of a slingshot. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive of the developers. The few voices defending VantageCore were drowned out by a tidal wave of criticism. Developers shared stories of their own experiences with companies that ignored open-source licenses. Venture capitalists publicly questioned whether VantageCore's due diligence process was adequate. Several of VantageCore's enterprise customers issued public statements expressing concern about the licensing status of the software they were using. VantageCore's stock price, they'd gone public in a SPAC merger 6 months earlier, dropped 14% in 2 trading days. Their market capitalization fell by approximately $168 million. VantageCore's CEO, a man named Richard Callaway, finally broke his silence on May 22, 2023. He published a blog post on VantageCore's website titled, "Our Commitment to Open Source." The post was a masterclass in corporate non-apology. "We take all intellectual property matters seriously," Callaway wrote. "VantageCore has always strived to be a good citizen of the open source community. We are conducting a comprehensive review of our use of third-party software components and are committed to addressing any issues that are identified." He did not acknowledge the lawsuit. He did not acknowledge the specific violations. He did not apologize to the developers. He did not commit to any specific corrective action. It was words carefully chosen to sound contrite without actually conceding anything. The tech community saw right through it. The response to Callaway's blog post was universally negative. Comments on Hacker News called it insulting, disingenuous, and a template for how not to handle a crisis. The Verge published a follow-up piece dissecting the blog post line by line, pointing out every evasion and non-statement. By this point, VantageCore's board of directors was clearly in crisis mode. We learned later, through disclosures in the litigation, that the board had held 3 emergency meetings in the week following the lawsuit filing. Their outside counsel had briefed them on the strength of our case and the potential damages exposure. Their PR firm had told them that the narrative was slipping beyond their control. On June 5, 2023, VantageCore's attorneys contacted Keller & Associates with a settlement proposal. The proposal had 3 components. First, VantageCore would pay a total of $4.5 million to the 7 copyright holders, allocated based on the relative prominence and usage of each project within VantageCore's product. My share as the libquery copyright holder was proposed at $800,000. Second, VantageCore would hire an independent third-party firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of all open-source license compliance across their entire product line, with results to be made public. Third, VantageCore would make a public statement acknowledging the license violations and apologizing to the affected developers. They would commit to releasing a fully compliant version of their product within 180 days, either by open-sourcing the relevant components or by replacing the infringing code with properly licensed alternatives. We discussed the proposal as a coalition. Opinions were divided. Marcus Chen and Rajiv Mehta were in favor of accepting. The financial settlement was significant, and the public acknowledgement would be a powerful precedent. Marcus pointed out that prolonged litigation could drain our resources even if we eventually won. Yuki Tanaka and Elena Voss were opposed. They felt that the settlement didn't go far enough. Yuki argued that VantageCore should be required to release the source code of their entire product, not just comply within 180 days. Elena felt that the public apology was insufficient and that VantageCore's leadership should face personal accountability. Sandra Okonkwo, with her legal background, provided the critical analysis. She pointed out that the settlement terms were actually quite favorable compared to typical outcomes in copyright litigation. Most GPL enforcement cases settle for far less, often with non-disclosure agreements that prevent the public from ever learning about the violations. The fact that VantageCore was agreeing to a public statement and a public audit was unusual and valuable. However, Sandra also identified a weakness in the proposal: the 180-day compliance window. She recommended countering with a 90-day window and specific milestones that would be publicly reported. She also recommended that the settlement include a clause allowing us to resume legal action if VantageCore failed to meet any milestone. I agreed with Sandra's analysis. I drafted a counter-proposal that incorporated her recommendations. The coalition reviewed it, made minor revisions, and authorized our attorneys to present it. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Both sides made concessions. VantageCore agreed to the 90-day compliance window with public milestones. We agreed to reduce the total settlement amount to $3.8 million in exchange for stronger compliance guarantees and a commitment from VantageCore to fund a $500,000 grant to the Software Freedom Conservancy for GPL enforcement efforts. The final settlement was signed on July 1, 2023. Here are the key terms. 1. VantageCore paid $3.8 million to the copyright holders, allocated as follows: libquery, $720,000, datapipe.js, Marcus Chen, $850,000, Secure Vault, Open Crypto Foundation, $650,000, GraphNav, Yuki Tanaka, $480,000, Authforge, Rajiv Mehta, $520,000, Schema Migrate, OpenDB Tools Collective, $300,000. 2. VantageCore issued a public statement acknowledging the license violations, specifically naming all 7 projects and their copyright holders. The statement included a direct apology from CEO Richard Callaway. 3. VantageCore committed to releasing a fully GPL-compliant version of their product within 90 days. They chose to replace the infringing code rather than open-source their entire product. This required a significant engineering effort that they later described as the most intensive refactoring project in the company's history. An independent firm, Open Source Initiative Certified Auditors, conducted a comprehensive license compliance audit of all VantageCore products. The results were published in a public report in October 2023. The report identified 2 additional GPL compliance issues in secondary products that VantageCore promptly remediated. 5. VantageCore established a permanent open-source compliance program, including a dedicated team responsible for reviewing all third-party software usage. The program's charter and annual compliance reports were published on VantageCore's website. 6. VantageCore contributed $500,000 to the Software Freedom Conservancy's GPL Enforcement Fund. 7. The settlement included a mutual non-disparagement clause that prevented either party from making negative public statements about the other after the settlement date. This was the one term I was ambivalent about, but our attorneys advised that it was standard and that the public record already contained all the relevant facts. The public statement from Richard Callaway was published on July 3, 2023. I'll quote the relevant portion. We sincerely apologize to the developers of libquery, datapipe, JS, Secure Vault, GraphNav, Authforge, Logstream, and Schema Migrate. Our use of these open-source projects did not comply with the terms of their respective licenses, and we failed to respond appropriately when this was brought to our attention. This was a failure of our internal processes and our values. We are committed to making it right and to ensuring that VantageCore is a responsible and respectful member of the open-source community going forward. It was, by corporate apology standards, remarkably direct. No, we're sorry if anyone was offended. No, mistakes were made, passive voice. He used the word we, and he named the projects. It wasn't perfect. Nothing a CEO says under legal duress is ever perfect, but it was more than I'd expected. The media coverage of the settlement was extensive. Most outlets framed it as a landmark victory for open-source developers. TechCrunch called it the most significant GPL enforcement action in a decade. Ars Technica published a detailed technical analysis of the evidence that had been submitted as part of the lawsuit. The EFF published a blog post celebrating the outcome and using it as a case study for why GPL enforcement matters. In the months following the settlement, I received hundreds of messages from other open-source developers who had experienced similar license violations but had lacked the resources or knowledge to pursue enforcement. Many of them asked for advice. Some asked if I could help them analyze potential violations in their own codebases. I realized that the methodology I'd developed, the structural comparison tools, the evidence-gathering process, the coalition-building approach, had value beyond my individual case. So I did what open-source developers do. I open-sourced it. I created a GitHub repository called GPL-Audit Toolkit. It contained the comparison engine I'd written, documentation on how to conduct GPL compliance investigations, template demand letters, and a guide to building enforcement coalitions. I licensed it under the MIT license, specifically to make it as widely usable as possible. The repository gained 8,000 stars in its first month. It was featured in several awesome lists of open-source tools. A legal tech startup reached out about integrating the comparison engine into their compliance platform. Marcus Chen used a portion of his settlement to found a new open-source project called LicenseGuard, a continuous monitoring tool that scans Docker images and NPM packages for GPL license compliance. It automated much of the manual analysis I'd done by hand. Yuki Tanaka contributed the graph analysis module. I contributed the structural comparison algorithm. Elena Voss handled documentation and community management. LicenseGuard became a standard tool in the DevOps compliance space. Within a year, it was being used by over 2,000 companies to audit their own software distributions for license compliance. VantageCore, for their part, underwent significant changes. Richard Callaway stepped down as CEO in September 2023. The board cited strategic differences in the announcement, but everyone in the industry knew the real reason. The company's new CEO, a former open-source executive named Patricia Wells, made license compliance a centerpiece of her tenure. She hired a VP of open-source strategy and published a comprehensive open-source contribution policy. VantageCore's engineering team completed the code replacement within the 90-day window. According to public statements, they replaced approximately 340,000 lines of code, the infringing portions derived from all 7 projects, with either internally developed alternatives or properly licensed third-party libraries. The refactoring project cost an estimated $12 million in engineering time and delayed their next product release by 4 months. Their stock price, which had dropped 14% after the lawsuit filing, eventually recovered. But the company's reputation in the developer community took much longer to heal. For at least 2 years after the settlement, any Hacker News thread about VantageCore would include multiple comments referencing the GPL violations. Developer conferences were less likely to accept their talk proposals. Recruiting senior engineers became more difficult, as candidates would ask about the company's open-source practices during interviews. This, I think, was the most significant consequence. Not the financial settlement. Not the legal precedent, but the reputational damage that persisted long after the legal matter was resolved. In the tech industry, where talent acquisition and developer trust are critical competitive advantages, the cost of being known as the company that stole open-source code is incalculable. Let me reflect on some of the lessons from this experience, organized systematically because that's how my brain works. Lesson 1. License choice matters. When I chose the GPL for libquery, I understood that it was a viral license that would require downstream users to share their modifications. I didn't choose it to be restrictive. I chose it because I believed in the principle that software built on shared foundations should remain shared. Without the GPL's copyleft mechanism, VantageCore could have used my code with no obligation to anyone. The license was the tool that made enforcement possible. Lesson 2. Evidence must be systematic and reproducible. If I'd just looked at some code and said, "This looks similar," no attorney would have taken the case, and no journalist would have written the story. The comparison tools, the similarity scores, the structural analysis, these turned a gut feeling into a compelling evidence package. In any dispute, the party with better documentation almost always prevails. Lesson 3. Coalitions amplify individual power. Any one of us, acting alone, could likely have been delayed into irrelevance by VantageCore's legal team. Together, we presented a coordinated front that was impossible to ignore. The coalition also shared costs, risks, and expertise. Sandra's legal background, Marcus's industry connections, Yuki's methodological rigor, Elena's communication skills, Rajiv's passion. Each person contributed something unique. Lesson 4. Public pressure is a force multiplier. The lawsuit was the legal instrument, but the media coverage was what actually forced VantageCore to the negotiating table. Without the TechCrunch article, the Hacker News thread, and the Twitter commentary, VantageCore could have buried the lawsuit in procedural motions for years. The public eye compressed the timeline from years to weeks. Lesson 5. The open source community is the ultimate enforcement mechanism. GPL licenses are enforced not primarily by lawyers, but by developers who care about the ecosystem. The community's response to our story, the messages of support, the contributions to GPL Audit Toolkit, the adoption of LicenseGuard, demonstrated that enforcement is a collective responsibility. I want to address one common misconception that I saw repeatedly in the coverage of this case. Several commentators described what VantageCore did as stealing code. While I understand the sentiment and use that language myself in the title of this post, the legal reality is more precise. VantageCore didn't steal the code in the traditional sense. They didn't break into my GitHub account and delete my repository. They didn't remove my name from the source files and claim they wrote it themselves. What they did was distribute code without a valid license. In copyright law, this is called infringement, not theft. The distinction matters because it frames the problem correctly. The issue isn't that someone took something that belonged to me. The issue is that someone distributed my work while ignoring the conditions under which I made it available. The GPL says, essentially, here is my code. You may use it, modify it, and distribute it, provided that you extend the same freedoms to others. VantageCore took the code, but refused to extend those freedoms. They wanted the benefit of the open-source software without the obligation. That's the core violation, and it's why the GPL exists. I also want to talk about the emotional dimension of this experience, because the analytical narrative I've presented doesn't fully capture what it felt like. When I first discovered that VantageCore was using libquery without compliance, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was anger, certainly, but there was also a sense of violation that went beyond the legal. Libquery was 4 years of my intellectual life. It represented late nights, failed approaches, breakthrough moments, and the satisfaction of solving hard problems. Seeing it embedded in a proprietary product, stripped of its license and attribution, felt deeply personal. When I discovered that 6 other projects were similarly affected, the anger shifted to something colder and more focused. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about a systemic practice that exploited the work of developers who had chosen to share their code with the world. The community trust that makes open source possible was being abused. During the coalition building phase, I was inspired by the responses I received from the other developers. Each of them had poured years of work into their projects, motivated by a genuine desire to build something useful for the community. None of them had expected to become involved in a copyright lawsuit. All of them stepped up anyway. The most difficult moment for me personally came during the negotiation phase, when VantageCore's attorneys implied that we were extorting the company by demanding a public apology and a financial settlement. The word extortion was used in a legal filing, and it stung. It suggested that we were the aggressors, that we were using the legal system to extract money from a legitimate business. I had to remind myself, and the coalition had to remind each other, that we were not the ones who had violated a license. We were not the ones who had ignored repeated communications. We were not the ones who had made a deliberate, documented decision to flout the law because we calculated the risk was low. We were enforcing our legal rights, which we were entitled to do, and which we were doing in the most transparent and measured way possible. The settlement check arrived on July 15, 2023. $720,000 minus attorney fees and coalition expenses left me with approximately $540,000. I used a portion of it to pay off my student loans, which felt appropriate given that I'd started libquery while still in graduate school. I put the rest into investments and a donor-advised fund that I plan to use to support open-source development. But the money was never the point. If VantageCore had simply complied with the GPL from the beginning, if they'd included my copyright notice, linked to the libquery repository, and released the source code of their derivative work, I would never have taken any action. The license was designed to ensure that everyone who benefited from the code also contributed back to the commons. VantageCore tried to take from the commons without giving back, and the system worked exactly as intended to prevent that. I still maintain libquery. It's at version 4.1.0 now, with a significantly improved query planner and support for distributed query execution. The GitHub repository has 11,000 stars, nearly triple what it had before the VantageCore incident. The NPM downloads are at 420,000 per week. The community of contributors has grown from 3 to 26. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Danica hadn't sent me that Slack message. Would VantageCore have continued using libquery indefinitely without compliance? Would they have expanded their use of GPL-licensed code to other products? Would the other 6 affected projects ever have discovered the violations? The answers to these questions are unknowable, but the probabilities suggest that without the enforcement action, VantageCore would have continued their practice indefinitely. They'd already been doing it for over 2 years when I discovered it. The leaked internal messages showed a deliberate, rationalized decision to ignore license obligations. Nothing short of external pressure was going to change that behavior. This is the fundamental insight about open-source license enforcement. It works, but only if someone is willing to do it. Licenses are not self-executing. They don't enforce themselves. They require copyright holders to monitor, investigate, and when necessary, litigate. This is a burden that falls disproportionately on individual developers, who have the least resources to carry it. The tools and methodologies that our coalition developed and open-sourced are intended to reduce this burden. If GPL Audit Toolkit makes it easier for the next developer to identify and document a license violation, and if the License Guard project makes it easier for companies to comply before a violation occurs, then the entire ecosystem benefits. I want to close with a thought about what open source really means. It's not just a development methodology. It's not just a licensing framework. It's a social contract. Developers share their work with the understanding that others will honor the terms of that sharing. When companies like VantageCore violate that contract, they don't just harm individual developers, they undermine the trust that makes the entire open-source ecosystem possible. The GPL is a legal instrument, but it's also a statement of values. It says that software freedom is important enough to defend, that the commons is worth protecting, that the work of individual developers, however small, deserves respect. I'm proud of what our coalition accomplished, not because we punished a bad actor, but because we demonstrated that the system works. The licenses are enforceable, the evidence is discoverable, the coalition is buildable. The public is supportive, and the outcome, while not perfect, represents a meaningful vindication of the principles that underpin the open-source community. If you're a developer who has released code under the GPL, and you suspect it's being used without compliance, don't assume you're powerless. Document everything. Use technical tools to build your evidence. Reach out to other affected developers, and remember that the license gives you the legal right to demand compliance. It's not a favor you're asking for, it's a right you already have. The open-source community gave VantageCore the code they needed to build their product. All the community asked in return was compliance with a license. VantageCore chose to ignore that ask. The community responded with the full force of its collective power. That's not revenge, that's enforcement. And it's how the ecosystem survives. One final technical note, because I can't help myself. After the settlement, VantageCore's engineering team reached out to ask if they could use libquery in their product going forward, this time in compliance with the GPL. I told them yes, of course. That was always the deal. Use the code. Modify it, distribute it, just honor the license. They did. VantageCore's product now includes libquery with proper attribution, a link to the repository, and their modifications released under the GPL. They even contributed a patch that improved the query planner's handling of window functions. I reviewed it, merged it, and added them to the contributor list. That's how it's supposed to work. Everyone benefits, the commons grows, and the license that made it possible quietly does its job in the background, enforcing the social contract that keeps the whole system running. I'm Marcus Chen. No, wait, that's not me. I'm the libquery developer. You know what? I've been writing this for a while now. Let me add a few more things I think are important. After the settlement, I was invited to speak at several open-source conferences. I gave a talk at OSCON called GPL Enforcement in Practice, a technical guide. The talk was recorded and has been viewed over 800,000 times on YouTube. I used the opportunity to walk through the technical methodology I'd developed, step by step, so that other developers could replicate it if needed. I was also contacted by 2 law schools, Stanford and Berkeley, asking if they could use the VantageCore case as a teaching example in their intellectual property courses. I agreed to both. The case study is now part of the curriculum, which means that future lawyers will study what happens when corporations ignore open-source licenses. One of the most satisfying outcomes has been the downstream effect on the broader industry. After the VantageCore story went viral, several other companies proactively conducted their own GPL compliance audits. I know this because multiple companies contacted me to ask if they could license my comparison tool for internal use. 3 of them found compliance issues in their own products and voluntarily came into compliance before any enforcement action was necessary. This is the ideal outcome, not punishment after the fact, but prevention before it's needed. If the VantageScore case causes even a few companies to take open-source license compliance seriously, it will have had a positive impact far beyond the immediate parties. I want to acknowledge some people who played important roles but haven't been mentioned yet. Danica Patel, who sent me the initial tip, continued to provide valuable inside information throughout the investigation. She left VantageScore shortly after the lawsuit was filed and later testified as a fact witness during the discovery phase. She's now a senior engineer at a company that has an exemplary open-source compliance program, which she helped design. Keller & Associates, our law firm, was exceptional. Our lead attorney, Jonathan Keller, has been practicing IP law for 25 years and had never lost a GPL enforcement case. His thoroughness and strategic thinking were critical. His associate, Maria Santos, handled most of the day-to-day communication with the coalition and kept us informed at every stage. Sarah Chen, the TechCrunch reporter, continued to cover the story long after the initial filing. Her follow-up pieces on the settlement, the audit results, and the industry-wide impact provided sustained public attention that helped ensure VantageScore followed through on their commitments. The Software Freedom Conservancy, while unable to participate directly, provided invaluable guidance on GPL enforcement strategy. Their executive director, Karen Sandler, is one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on open-source licensing, and her advice shaped several key elements of our approach. Finally, I want to acknowledge the open-source community at large. The response to this case, the messages of support, the contributions to our tools, the amplification of our story, demonstrated that the community understands the importance of license compliance and is willing to support enforcement efforts. This collective support is what made the outcome possible. Let me address one more thing. After the story went viral, I received messages from people who accused me of being greedy for accepting a financial settlement. If you really cared about open source, the argument went, you would have just asked them to comply and not demanded money. This argument misunderstands both the purpose of the settlement and the reality of enforcement. The financial settlement served multiple purposes. First, it compensated us for the harm caused by the infringement, harm that was real and quantifiable, even if it didn't involve direct financial loss. Second, it created a deterrent effect. A company that knows GPL violations can result in multi-million-dollar settlements is more likely to take compliance seriously than a company that knows the worst-case scenario is a polite request. Third, the settlement funded the tools and infrastructure that will help prevent future violations. But more fundamentally, the argument misses the point. The GPL doesn't say you can use my code for free. It says you can use my code under these conditions. When someone violates those conditions, they're taking something that was never offered to them. Seeking compensation for that taking isn't greed. It's justice. I also want to reflect on what I might have done differently, because no system is perfect, and no plan survives contact with the enemy without requiring adjustments. If I were to do it over again, I would have started the coalition building process earlier. I spent about 6 weeks investigating VantageScore's product on my own before reaching out to the other developers. In retrospect, I could have begun contacting them as soon as I identified the first 2 or 3 violations, which would have given us more time to coordinate and build our case. I would also have been more aggressive about preserving evidence. While I did document everything thoroughly, I didn't implement a formal chain of custody protocol for the extracted code until our attorneys recommended it. If VantageScore had somehow discovered the investigation and pushed an update that modified the infringing code, some of my evidence could have been challenged. A formal chain of custody protocol from the beginning would have eliminated this risk. Finally, I would have engaged with the EFF and the Software Freedom Conservancy earlier in the process. Both organizations had expertise and resources that could have accelerated the investigation. I didn't contact them until after the coalition was formed, because I initially thought we could handle everything ourselves. In practice, their guidance on legal strategy was invaluable, and I should have sought it sooner. These are minor criticisms of a process that, overall, worked remarkably well. The fact that 7 individual developers from 4 countries were able to coordinate a successful enforcement action against a billion-dollar corporation in less than 6 months is a testament to both the power of open-source licenses and the strength of the developer community. Let me tell you about what happened with each of the other developers after the settlement. Marcus Chen used his settlement to fund a sabbatical from his FANG job. He spent 6 months working on LicenseGuard full-time, building it into a production-grade tool. He then returned to his job but continued to maintain LicenseGuard on the side. He's since been promoted to principal engineer and credits the VantageCore case with giving him the most meaningful professional experience of my career. Yuki Tanaka published an academic paper based on her analysis methodology, titled Structural Code Comparison for License Compliance Verification. The paper was presented at the International Conference on Software Engineering and won the Best Paper Award. She's now one of the leading academic researchers in the field of software license compliance. Rajiv Mehta, the most passionate member of our coalition, used his settlement to start a consulting firm focused on open-source license compliance. His company, called GPL Compliance Partners, advises tech companies on how to use GPL-licensed software legally and effectively. He's been surprisingly successful, which he attributes to the VantageCore case serving as the best marketing material money can't buy. Elena Voss, who had contributed her time rather than money to the coalition, received a job offer from a major European open-source company that wanted to strengthen its compliance team. She accepted and is now their head of open-source compliance. She told me it was the first job she'd ever had that paid me to care about something I already cared about. Sandra Okonkwo and the Open Crypto Foundation used their settlement to expand their legal defense fund, which now helps open-source developers pursue enforcement actions. They've funded 3 additional GPL enforcement cases since the VantageCore settlement, each of which resulted in compliance without the need for litigation. The OpenDB Tools Collective used their settlement to fund a major rewrite of Schema Migrate, adding support for 5 additional database engines. They also established a formal governance structure with a compliance committee to ensure that all contributions are properly licensed. As for me, I continue to work on libquery and my other open-source projects. I also joined the advisory board of the Software Freedom Conservancy, where I help evaluate potential enforcement cases and advise developers on their options. The GPL Audit Toolkit repository has grown into a small ecosystem of its own. Contributors have added support for comparing Python, Go, Rust, and Java code, in addition to the original JavaScript support. The toolkit has been used in at least a dozen GPL enforcement actions worldwide, several of which have resulted in successful compliance outcomes. I think about the VantageCore case often, usually when I'm working on libquery late at night. It changed my understanding of what open source means, not just as a development practice, but as a legal and social framework that requires active maintenance. The code doesn't protect itself. The license doesn't enforce itself. It requires people, developers, lawyers, journalists, community members, to make it work. I'm grateful to everyone who helped make it work in this case. And I'm committed to helping make it work for the next developer who finds their code in a proprietary product without their permission. If that developer is you, here's my advice. Don't get mad. Get systematic. Document everything. Build your evidence. Find your coalition. And when you're ready, enforce. The license is on your side. The law is on your side. The community is on your side. All you have to do is act. Edit. I'm seeing some questions in the comments about the technical details of the comparison tool. Let me elaborate. The core algorithm works in 3 phases. Phase 1 is parsing. It takes each JavaScript file and produces an abstract syntax tree using the Esprima parser. Phase 2 is normalization. It strips out variable names, function names, and string literals, leaving only the structural skeleton of the code. This prevents trivial renaming from reducing the similarity score. Phase 3 is comparison. It computes a tree edit distance between the normalized ASTs using the Zhang-Shasha algorithm, then normalizes the result to a 0-to-1 scale. The 0.87 similarity score for libquery was computed across 47 source files that I could confidently match between my code and VantageCore's product. The per-file scores ranged from 0.71 to 0.96, with a median of 0.89. The lowest scores were in files where VantageCore had made the most modifications, typically adding proprietary features on top of the original code. The highest scores were in utility files and test files, which appeared to have been copied almost verbatim. For the other projects, the methodology was identical, but the specific scores varied. DataPipe.js had a composite score of 0.84. Secure Vault scored 0.91, which makes sense because encryption libraries have highly constrained design patterns. There aren't many ways to implement AES key scheduling, and VantageCore's implementation matched the Secure Vault structure almost exactly. GraphNav scored 0.79, the lowest of the 7. This is because Yuki's graph traversal code is inherently more flexible. Different developers might legitimately implement similar graph algorithms with different structural choices. However, even 0.79 was well above the threshold, and the presence of identical custom data structures, a Fibonacci heap implementation that Yuki had written specifically for GraphNav, made the derivation clear. Authforge scored 0.88, which included an exact match of Rajiv's custom base64 URL encoding function, a non-standard implementation that Rajiv had created to handle a specific edge case in JWT token formatting. The odds of two developers independently implementing the same non-standard base64 URL encoding with the same edge case handling are, to put it mildly, astronomical. Logstream scored 0.82. Elena's structured logging library had a distinctive feature, a custom log-level hierarchy that included levels like verbose and trace, in addition to the standard debug, info, warn, and error. VantageCore's logging system had the same custom hierarchy, including the same somewhat unusual decision to make trace more verbose than verbose, rather than the other way around. Schema Migrate scored 0.85. The most damning evidence here was the migration file format. The OpenDB Tools Collective had designed a custom YAML-based migration format with specific fields like checksum, depends on, and rollback strategy. VantageCore's product used the identical format down to the field names and the validation rules. Taken individually, any one of these matches could potentially be explained as coincidence or convergent design. Taken together, they formed an overwhelming pattern of systematic code appropriation. Edit 2. A few people have asked about the total cost of the litigation and how the settlement was allocated. Total attorney fees through settlement were approximately $310,000. This included the initial retainer, motion practice, the temporary restraining order filing, discovery, and settlement negotiations. Keller and Associates worked at a blended rate of $475 an hour, which is below market for a top-tier IP firm in San Francisco. Jonathan Keller gave us a significant discount because he believed in the case and wanted to set a strong precedent. The $310,000 in fees was paid from the settlement before distribution to the copyright holders. After fees and coalition expenses, which totaled approximately $45,000 for travel, filing fees, expert consultations, and the comparison tool development, the net proceeds were distributed according to the agreed allocation. I received $720,000 gross, which after my share of fees and expenses came to approximately $540,000 net. This was life-changing money, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But I also don't want it to overshadow the principle at stake. I would have pursued this case regardless of the financial outcome, and the money was never the primary motivation. The other copyright holders' net proceeds varied based on their allocation, but all of them received significant amounts relative to their individual situations. For Elena Voss, the $280,000 gross allocation, approximately $210,000 net, represented more than 3 years of her freelance income. For the OpenDB Tools Collective, the $300,000 funded their project for the next 5 years at their current burn rate. Edit 3. I've been asked whether VantageCore ever faced any criminal liability for their actions. The short answer is no. Copyright infringement in the United States is generally a civil matter, not a criminal one, unless it involves large-scale commercial piracy for direct financial gain. VantageCore's use of the code, while clearly infringing, didn't meet the threshold for criminal prosecution. However, the willful nature of the infringement, as documented in the leaked internal messages, could have affected the damages calculation if the case had gone to trial. Willful copyright infringement carries statutory damages of up to $150,000 per work, compared to $30,000 for non-willful infringement. With 7 works, the potential statutory damages for willful infringement exceeded $1 million, and the actual damages based on VantageCore's revenue could have been much higher. The settlement amount of $3.8 million represented a discount from the potential trial exposure, which our attorneys estimated at $15 million. This discount is standard in settlements, as it reflects the time value of money, the uncertainty of trial outcomes, and the cost avoidance of not having to go through discovery and trial. I think that covers the major questions. If you have others, I'll do my best to answer them in the comments. One last thought. If you're a developer who contributes to open source, thank you. Your work matters. Your licenses matter. Your rights matter. And if someone tries to tell you otherwise, remember the VantageCore case. The system works, but only if you use it.